Okay, folks, hope everybody's doing well. Here we are for the last lecture in the intercession course before the midterm exam. This is going to be an introduction to the philosophy of religion. As all my other lectures in intercession have been, this one is a bit of a truncated version of what I would normally give in a regular semester, just because we move at an accelerated pace and it's a lot of material. And so what I'll mainly do here is talk about the headism religion in Rick and Morty and how that helps us learn about a new reasoning fallacy, a new informal fallacy. And then we'll look at two classical arguments for God's existence after that. So those will be the two big topics here. Normally in an introduction to the philosophy of religion, you might cover the problem of faith and reason, and then several arguments for and against God's existence. But we'll just do a little bit of that here this time around. So first, let's look at this religion of headism, right? And the philosophy of religion, right? So just like epistemology and metaphysics are key areas in basic subfields in academic philosophy. Philosophy of religion is also its own subfield. And so I write here that the philosophy of religion is a major subfield of academic philosophy that focuses on studying the epistemological, metaphysical, and value questions that arise as a result of religion. So because of religious claims, right? So religions of various sorts tend to make metaphysical claims about what we can know and not know, claims about what sorts of things exist and don't exist, and whether it's an afterlife, supernatural beings, and so forth, immaterial soul that we talked about briefly in the last lecture on personal identity. They often make moral claims as well, and so those could be investigated as well. And so I list here some of the main questions that the philosophy of religion investigates. So do any gods exist? Does a God exist, or any gods, right? And then of course you have to talk about what kind of God are we talking about and what would count for and against the existence of that kind of God. We'll do a little bit of that in the second half of this lecture. Does religious faith conflict with reason, or is religious faith rational? That's the problem of faith versus reason. That would be a common topic to cover in a philosophy of religion class, and there you would normally do something a little bit different than I'm going to do with headism, because the usual way of approaching that topic is to think about different conceptions of faith. How are we conceiving of what that means? And then conceptions of reason, and then seeing, whether they're conceptually compatible with one another or whether they're contradictory. And so there you might look at thinkers like Soren Kierkegaard or St. Thomas Aquinas, W.C. Clifford, just a few of the big names of classical positions that are usually covered in an introductory class on that kind of topic. We'll look at a particular set of reasons, particular arguments for headism in Get Swifty. So we'll take a little bit of a different angle than I might normally do. And then, of course, questions about the relationship between morality and religion might arise here too. And so those are just some of the basic ideas that you might cover in the philosophy of religion. And we're, again, going to take a look at the reasoning behind headism, which is a religion in Rick and Morty that occurs or arises, right? A new religion that's formed. And then look at some classical arguments for theism. All right, so first, let's look at the fallacy of headism, right? Or the question of the logic of headism. And as your reading assignment for today focused on this particular issue, and the basic idea is that correlation isn't the same thing as causation, and then there's this correlation isn't causation fallacy, or the false cause fallacy. And there's actually a couple of different versions of this. I had you watch another little short video from Wisecrack that does a pretty good job of going through the false cause fallacy and different versions of it. So I won't go and do that again here, since I've already assigned you that, but I do want to raise a couple of points to think about with regard to some of the things that were said in that video, as well as you're reading, where there's a bit of a difference. And so it helps make a couple of points about informal fallacies in general and false cause fallacy in particular. All right, and so as you've seen the episode, probably the Get Swifty episode, the townspeople reason that they should found a new religion when a giant head, or really a bunch of heads, appear out in space and command to them to show me what you got. And so the question is, well, do the townspeople in the episode, do they give logical reasons in order to support this belief in headism? All right, so what justifies belief in terms of religion here is just the basic question, right? And so think about that notion of the propositional knowledge of the propositional account of knowledge that we talked about last time, and the three elements or three requirements for that. What kind of justification can be given for headism? And so recall that we've already talked a little bit about this back in the logic lesson, and here's this definition of a fallacy again. Remember, an argument for us is a group of propositions that are trying to prove something, has at least one premise and a conclusion, and a fallacy is the term gets used by logicians, means an error in reasoning. Sometimes, at least in popular discourse, you might hear people talk about a fallacy just as a false claim, but logicians have a little bit different idea in mind there. So again, the definition that we're working with here is the one that's at home in philosophy and in a lot of different scholarship, actually, on critical thinking and so forth. And it's the idea of a fallacy. It's an error in reasoning such that even if the premise is true, that it doesn't logically imply the truth of the conclusion. So that's a little bit different than maybe the more commonplace definition of fallacy that you might hear sometimes. So just, again, be aware of that more technical definition that we're using here. And so here's the basic idea of the false cause fallacy, and there are different varieties, as you already know, of this fallacy. Oversimplified cause is one. The no cause for a cause is another one, where it's not the right cause for the event. So sometimes you see that as well. And then the two that are discussed most in the video the other video I had you watch from Wisecrack, are the post hoc ergo propter hoc and the cum hoc ergo propter hoc, which are Latin for the phrases that after the thing, therefore because of the thing, and with this, therefore because of this, right? So two different versions of the false cause fallacy, at least that we'll focus on here. All versions of the false cause fallacy involve this mistaken idea, I'm sorry, let me back up here. The versions of the false cause fallacy that we're going to worry about the most involve this mistaking of correlation for causation. It's probably a phrase you've heard before, and so that's what makes them both false cause fallacies, right? And so in one version of the fallacy, the after the thing, therefore because of the thing version, or after this because of this version, is that the correlation of events preceding or succeeding one another is mistaken for a causal relationship, right? And in the other version, the with this, therefore because of this, it's the idea is that because two things are correlated with one another because they occur simultaneously, that there must have been a causal relationship between the two things. So let's take a look at this. First, here's just the basic version of the false cause fallacy, that non-causa, pro-causa version, no cause for a cause version. This is probably maybe a very common version of the false cause fallacy, and here's an example of it. All of the versions are fallacious in the context in which they're employed. What makes them fallacious, what makes them fallacious attributes of a causal relationship or a cause and effect relationship is that there's insufficient evidence to establish that causal relationship. Incomplete information, insufficient evidence, right? Or mistaken evidence. So here's an example of this basic version of the false cause fallacy. Successful business executives are paid salaries in excess of $100,000. Therefore, the best way to ensure that Ferguson will become a successful executive is to raise his salary to at least $100,000, right? So not a cause for the not the cause of that effect there, right? So here we just have a mistaken cause for the event that occurred, right? Much the same way you might worry about arguments that you might hear over whether video games cause school shootings or something like that, right? There's a lot of factors that could go into that event, that effect, rather than just that one cause. So maybe oversimplified cause as well. And then we get to the type of false cause fallacies that occur in Get Schwifty. And again, I'm just going to kind of add a layer of detail to some of the stuff that's discussed in the readings that you've done and the video that you've already watched from Wisecrack. So this is the version that's after this because of this version, right? So this version occurs when an arguer ascribes a causal relationship to an effect merely because it preceded the event in close temporal order. So again, a very common type of erroneous reason or potentially fallacious reasoning. So here the idea is that just because one event came before or preceded event B, the second event, that event A must have caused event B. So I've set this up and given a little format for us here. Notice it's a valid format. It's a modus ponens argument, but informal fallacies have to do with the content of the language, right? With the content of the argument, excuse me. So here the content of the argument is a loose correlation, not a causal relationship between two events. So just because something comes before another event doesn't mean that it necessarily or even probabilistically caused that event. So again, we're going to see this version in Get Schwifty. Right? So here's the first of two ways of thinking about what the townspeople are up to in this, one of the early scenes in the episode. There's a lot of different versions of this fallacy, or a lot of instances, rather, of this fallacy that occur in the episode. I'm not going to go through all of them because part of them has already been discussed in the Wisecrack video. So I've just reformulated what I take to be the townspeople's reasoning here. So I'm going to come back and make a point about how I've taken that reasoning as opposed to the Wisecrack video, because there's a bit of an issue there between your reading assignment and what is said in the Wisecrack video on the philosophy of Get Schwifty. So here's my reconstruction. If praying to the giant heads immediately precedes the head's approval, then praying caused the head's approval, right? It was the reason for the approving. Praying to the giant heads immediately preceded the head's approval, thus praying caused the head to approve. That's what your reading assignment would call or label as a false positive, something that we think is true but is actually false. All right. Here's then another version of that that same fallacy, the post hoc propter hoc version. And this time around, I have the dialogue from the episode here, from the Rick and Morty president. He says, all right, thank you, Mr. Sanchez, talking to Rick there. Change of plan, people. Get me Pharrell, Randy Newman, Billy Corgan, The Dream. The Dream, he wrote Umbrella and the Single Ladies. You people haven't heard of The Dream, right? You're going to want to put them on a giant speaker system at your sonic testing facility at Area 51. How do you know about that? President then says, for God's sake, Nathan, the man turns people into snakes. He can use Google Maps. The aide says, sir, Pharrell, Newman, Corgan, and that Dream guy, they're all dead. And then the president wonders, and here comes the erroneous inference or the questionable inference that he makes. Wow, is that possible? Do people just die when I name them? Right? And so again, I've reconstructed that reasoning here in the form of one of our argument types. So if naming people precedes their death, then naming the people causes their death. Naming people preceded their death, thus naming the people caused their death. Again, we have a false positive there. Right? So two examples of that post hoc propter hoc version, the false cause fallacy. Again, there the events following from one another in close temporal order is where the correlation is and the alleged causal relationship. But just because, there's the kind of key thing, just because they occurred in close temporal order, just that fact alone doesn't mean that one of them, the first one, caused the second one. Insufficient or incomplete evidence is, as we know from watching the episode, other stuff is happening around these times as well that various characters are unaware of, and in part because they have incomplete evidence, right, insufficient evidence, they make an erroneous inference. Right? Human beings kind of naturally want to find patterns, right? But they're not all logical patterns that we want to ascribe to the world. All right, and so here's a point I want to make about informal fallacies in general, and in the false cause fallacy in particular. In the wisecrack video, they actually interpret that same first argument that I gave from the townspeople and that's used in your reading assignment for today. They interpret that slightly differently. And as a result, they still think it's a false cause fallacy, but the folks from wisecrack think it's a different version of the false cause fallacy. They call it an example of the cum hoc ergo propter hoc version, the with this because of this version. Right? So again, I'm just kind of formulated a basic little, giving you a diagram of how an argument of that sort might look. Again, remember, these are informal fallacies, so that they can occur in any argument, even if it has a valid structure. Having an informal fallacy, and it would make the premises dubious, right? Or mean that the premises don't actually support the conclusion, again, according to our notion of a fallacy. Either because of it, well, in this case, because, again, not because of the structure of the argument, because of the content, because they're informal. All right, so if A, praying, happens at the same time as B, approval, then A caused B. A happened at the same time as B, thus A caused B. Again, this is the cum hoc ergo propter hoc version of it. And so one of the things I want to note here is that, well, how could it be both versions of this thing? Well, the townspeople's reasoning isn't precise to the viewer, or maybe even to each other within the context of the show. We're having to interpret what their argument might be. It's kind of implicit based on what they do and the things that they do say, right? And so putting that stuff together, we can think, oh, they must have been thinking in the following way. The folks at Wisecrack have interpreted the townspeople to be giving an argument that's rooted not in close temporal order, but simultaneity. So there's the correlation for them. The reason why I want to point that out is because since these are informal fallacies, right, there's a little bit of an art to picking them out. You have to know what the argument is precisely in order to identify the fallacy, if there is one in it. But because language is ambiguous, that means there might be different ways of reading an argument, right? And then you have to go through each version of it and think about what's precisely being argued. And so depending on which way you go, I mean, I'm not saying that you can just make out of the townspeople's behavior and their words whatever you want. We're constrained, right, by what they say and do in terms of interpreting what their argument might be. But even because there is some ambiguity, we might go different ways there. So one way we might read that scenario is as the townspeople saying it's the close temporal order that is the reason, and the correlation there that's the reason for deriving the conclusion, for thinking that A caused B. Or we might say, well, these are happening basically at the same time, simultaneously, and it's that correlation that they're occurring at the same time or with each other that's the reason that's been given for the conclusion, right? So we're still trying to flesh out then what exactly is the precise nature of their arguing. We can't ask them individually or as a group to clarify, and so we just have to go with what we're given here. And that might be the case in the real world. If you're reading an article or a newspaper op-ed and you can't ask the person to clarify what they mean, you have to think about the different possibilities of what they mean. And if any one of those might have a fallacy involved in it. So there's one thing to worry about there. The other thing to note is that because these are informal fallacies, not formal fallacies, they should really be treated as suspect arguments in a given context, right? So it's not like that these are hard and fast rules or absolute rules of reasoning when it comes to informal fallacies. They are informal, right? They don't have to do with simply the underlying structure. And so that might mean that unlike affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent, you'll never have an argument in which both of those occur. They would be different underlying forms. You might have more than one informal fallacy occurring in an argument, or you might have some room for arguing about which fallacy might occur. That doesn't mean in every case that's going to be true, but in some cases where the argument might be ambiguous or left implicit, you might have that possibility. So I bring that up here because here we've got the wisecrack folks arguing that it's one version of a false cause fallacy, and the article that I had you read out of the textbook arguing that it's another, right? That they agree it's false cause, they're just disagreeing over what they take the precise argument to be, the townspeople's argument actually to be. One other version of a false cause that you might look at is to check out this clip from South Park, the medicinal fried chicken episode. At the very end, the South Park doctor gives an argument, and it looks pretty suspect as well. So if you have a minute, take a look at that and try to figure out what version of a false cause fallacy the doctor makes there. All right, so again, I'll pause here for just a second before I start the second part of the lecture. If you have questions about fallacies or the false cause fallacies in particular, you can save those for the live discussion session, or you can put your questions in the discussion forum, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. All right, so with that, then let's go ahead and move on to the second part of this introduction to philosophy of religion lecture, and let's look at the problem of God's existence. So we've just looked at the arguments for headism, and they're pretty bad, right? Just understanding a little bit of basic logic, you can see that those are pretty bad. But of course, many different arguments might be given for a range of different religious beliefs. Perhaps someone wants to give a different argument than the ones that we see in the Get Swifty episode for headism, the headism religion. So this is one of the things that makes philosophy, to me, very interesting, but maybe to other people very frustrating, because you have to go through each and every little iteration of these different arguments or families of arguments to figure things out. And it's usually the case that a really important philosophical position is it doesn't hinge on the success of just one argument, but a cumulative case, and we're not even studying the full cumulative case for these things. But a big issue then in philosophy of religion is God's existence, and there are more influential arguments that are not as obviously fallacious or as obviously problematic, given for things like theism, or atheism or agnosticism even, that are not obviously flawed the way that the arguments for headism are. And so we'll look at two arguments for God's existence in this next section: the design argument or teleological argument and the ontological argument. These are two of the three arguments that make up what's called the classical case for theism. We're not even going to look, just because of time, for the sake of time, at arguments for atheism or agnosticism. We're just going to look at these two classical versions of these two different styles of argumentation, and some basically one criticism of each, and that'll do it for us here. So the classical case for theism, as I mentioned, usually three basic arguments: the ontological argument, the design argument, and so design, teleology, that's one kind of argument; the cosmological or first cause argument, and then the ontological argument. The cosmological argument and the design argument are both a posteriori. So you might remember that term or that distinction from the epistemology section. That means that there are arguments that take their point of departure from stuff that we can observe about the world. The ontological argument, on the other hand, is an a priori argument, and it's based on how we conceive of God in the first place. And again, we'll look not really at the contemporary debate over these arguments, but at two classical formulations of it that make really good material for critical thinking exercises about these topics. So the teleological or design argument for theism. And by theism here, I mean, the kind of God that is posited by the Abrahamic religions, right? Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Even though they have lots and lots of differences between those religions, they're all monotheistic religions that posit an omnicompetent God, a maximally perfect God, a perfect personal being, right? That is concerned with humanity. So that's what I have in mind by theism. I'm not talking about Thor or Zeus, those kinds of gods, right? So the design or teleological argument, as I mentioned, is an a posteriori argument or type of argument that tries to imply the existence of God on the basis of the appearance, at least the appearance of order, complexity, and purpose in the natural world. And I mean like the natural world, not necessarily like human societies or something like that. This is stuff that we're supposed to be able to observe in nature, like in biology or anatomy or something like that, or in the contemporary version in the laws of physics, biology, and chemistry. So we'll look at a classical version of this. That's probably already tipping you off that there might be some problems with it. And there are problems with just about every argument that we're covering this semester. That's kind of how it goes in philosophy, especially because we're not really looking at much of the contemporary argument or debate, the contemporary state of the debate. We're looking at kind of some background of that. Again, that makes good material for developing the sorts of critical thinking and philosophical reasoning skills that are really the kind of the big practical use of studying philosophy. So if we were going to look at the contemporary version of this, we'd have to learn some contemporary physics first, right? This version is a little bit easier to just jump into. All right, so this comes from William Paley. You might have heard of this watchmaker argument before. That's Paley's version of a design or teleological argument. So again, I pulled out some passages since you don't have access to them, and then I'm going to formulate the argument and then look at a influential criticism of at least these earlier analogical versions of the design argument. So Paley's watch. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitch my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever, nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I found a watch upon the ground and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think that the answer which I had given that, for all I knew, that the watch might have always been there. So what he's doing is picking up on the idea that the watch has some characteristics that the stone does not seem to have. At least the stone by itself. He's going to compare the watch to other aspects of nature. So he says, for this reason and for no other, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, teleology, purpose or end, right? Goal. That they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, that motion is so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, and that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, if in a different size from what they are, or placed after any other manner or in any other order than which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, nor none which it would have answered to the use that is now served by it. And he goes on. But being once, as we have said, observed and understood, the inference we think is inevitable that the watch must have had a watchmaker, that there must have existed at some time and in some place or other an artificer or artificers who forms it for the purpose which we find it to actually answer, who comprehended its construction and who designed its use. And he's going to go on here and talk about what he thinks the architect of this nature must be like. So he says, every indication of contrivance and every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature. There's his analogy. With the difference on the side of nature being greater and more, that in degree which exceeds all computation. I mean that the contrivances of nature surpass the contrivances of art in the complexity, subtlety, and curiosity of which of the mechanism, and still more, if possible, that go beyond them in number and variety. The marks of design are too strong to be got over. Design must have had a designer. That designer must have been a person. That person is God. And as you can see in this passage here, he's listing off many of the basic attributes that are ascribed to, like the monotheistic conception of God as a maximally perfect being. Usually, or sometimes in philosophy, we'll kind of shorten this and talk about an omnicompetent God, which means having at least 3 divine perfections, all-knowing, all-powerful, and morally perfect. And of course, there are others that would go along with that, but that gives you a basic idea of what we're talking about. All right, and so here's the basic structure of an argument by analogy. A has properties P, Q, R, and S, and T. B has properties Q, R, and S, thus B probably has property T as well. So again, don't get caught up on the number of analogs or number of points of comparison. There only has to be one in order for it to be an argument by analogy. All right, and so again, the argument functions by saying this thing is like this other thing, and because they share several properties in common with one another, it's likely that the second thing has this property that we don't already know that it has, but that is shared by the first thing, or has the first thing has. Right? So here's my reconstruction of Paley's argument. Again, it's an analogical version of the design argument. Human artifacts, Paley's example is the watch, have the properties of complexity, order, and purposefulness because they are the product of an intelligent designer, a watchmaker. Nature also has the properties of complexity, order, and purposefulness. Of course, he goes on to say that it's even more complex than the watch. Thus, nature is also the product of an intelligent designer. So that designer was, as we see often say, God. God's the watchmaker, in other words. And so that's the basic argument. And now we can go to an influential criticism of analogical versions of the design argument by the philosopher David Hume. Paley's version of the argument, he formulated it well before a lot of the advances in 20th century science. But here's Hume, right? Hume's going to give a particular kind of challenge to this analogical version of the design argument. Hume was an empiricist. He thought all genuine knowledge had to come from sense experience of the world, and he's gonna try and challenge the design inference based on the analogy. So here's Hume on the design argument. He says, can you, he's talking about the proponent of the design argument here. These passages come from his dialogues on natural religion, Hume's work, dialogues on natural religion. He says, can you prove the unity of the deity? A great number of men join in building a house or a ship, in rearing a city, in framing a commonwealth. Why may not several deities combine in contriving and framing this world? This is so much greater similarity to human affairs. Then he goes on, a man who follows your hypothesis is able perhaps to assert or conjecture that the universe arose from something like design. But beyond that position, he cannot ascertain one single circumstance and is left afterwards to fix every point of his theology by the utmost license of fancy and hypothesis. So that's two basic points there. He says, look, if we're following this analogy between how human artifacts are produced and how the world might have been produced, well, then it doesn't look like it gets you to a single God. Wouldn't it imply that there were many gods that designed the world? Right? And then as another part of the same general line of criticism, Hume develops a thought experiment called the infant and inferior deity. And so here's the thought experiment that he gives. He says, suppose that a person with a very limited intelligence were brought into the world and assured that it was the workmanship of a sublime and benevolent being. In other words, you're raised to believe the design argument. Right? He might perhaps be surprised it finding the world so full of vice and misery and disorder, but would never retract his former belief if founded on any very solid argument, since such a limited intelligence must be sensible to its own blindness and ignorance, and must allow that there may be many solutions of those phenomena which will forever escape his comprehension. But suppose that this creature is not antecedently convinced of a supreme intelligence, benevolent and powerful, and is left to gather such a belief from the appearance of things. In other words, can we really infer from what we observe about the world that it was the workmanship of a perfect designer, an omnicompetent designer? Hume's answer to that is no. Right? No. So part of what's going on here is that Hume's pointing out that and saying, look, if the appearance of design counts in favor of a designer, then where we observe a lack of purpose or bad design or no design, no order and complexity, then that counts against the existence of a designer, right? So he's got like an evil twin argument here. He's saying if the appearance of design counts in favor of a designer, then the appearance of disorder in the universe, a lack of purpose in natural systems of the universe or anatomy or whatever, physical things, right, count against the existence of a designer. So here's what Hume's answer is to that thought experiment. Notice if you were going to say yes, you'd have to pinpoint the observation that you could make about the natural world that would prove that it was the product of an omnicompetent designer, not just a really smart designer, but an omnicompetent designer. So he says, look, it could, the world could be the first rude essay of some infant deity who afterwards abandoned it, ashamed of his lame performance, or the work of some dependent inferior deity and the object of derision to his superiors. So in both the first set of passages that I've had from Hume, he's challenging the analogy and saying, look, the analogy doesn't prove the theistic conclusion. It could have been a polytheistic situation. A bunch of designers could have done it. And in the second thought experiment, in the second passage, the thought experiment passage that he gives, he's challenging the idea that it's an omnicompetent designer, right? Or that even if there are multiple designers, that that they're omnicompetent. And so here's something to think about in terms of getting ready for a short answer exercise or for thinking about the issue more thoroughly, right? Is assuming Hume's criticism is correct, what is he saying is the flaw in Paley's watchmaker argument? Is Hume claiming that there is no appearance of design or purpose in nature? Is Hume claiming that there's one or more false premise in Paley's argument or our reconstruction of Paley's argument? Is Hume claiming that the premises, even if true, are insufficient to show that the conclusion is more likely true than false? So in other words, is he showing, is he claiming some kind of fallacy is at work there? And to that end, take a look, and it won't take you long, look up faulty or weak analogy fallacy. The usual way that fallacy works is that we say, well, there's a dissimilarity between the two things that are compared, therefore it doesn't prove the conclusion. In Hume's criticism, it looks like he's saying, if you follow the original intent of the analogy between human affairs and divine affairs, how human beings design things, artifacts, and how gods or a god might have designed the world, that we should conclude that, like many people will come together to build the computer that I'm using to record this lecture, that many people would have come together, many gods would have designed the universe. So a slight twist on a faulty analogy or weak analogy fallacy there. All right, so that is a little bit about a classical version of the design argument. And there, of course, you know, what we're leaving out in class are the rejoinders back and forth over this classical version, and especially the more contemporary debate. So if you're really interested in the design argument, what you really ought to look at in terms of the contemporary status of this debate is look at the fine-tuned universe argument. And it's a contemporary version of the design argument. And instead of working on an analogy, it looks at it draws on some findings from contemporary science, which of course Paley didn't have access to. We didn't know some of the stuff we know about the laws of physics, for example, and chemistry. We know more about that stuff today than Paley would have known. So you take a look at that if you're interested in exploring this issue further. For now, let's go ahead and take a look at a classical version of the ontological argument. So, as I mentioned, the teleological argument is an a posteriori argument. A priori arguments, or excuse me, ontological arguments are a priori arguments. In other words, what they're trying to do is they're trying to derive the existence of God, not from something that we observe about the natural world, whether its design in the world, or like the first cause argument that the world exists at all, that there's a universe at all. It's trying to derive the actual existence of God, or the existence of God, from the concept of God as a maximally perfect being, right? So an omnicompetent designer. Classical version of this kind of argument comes from Anselm. And so he says, and so, Lord, do thou doest give me understanding to faith, give understanding to faith. Give me, so far as thou knowest it to be profitable, to understand that thou art as we believe, and that thou art as which we believe. And indeed, we believe that thou art a being none greater than which can be conceived. So Anselm's idea is that God is defined as a being none greater than which can be conceived. He's a maximally perfect being. He possesses all the best things in the most perfect way, all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect, and so forth. I'm just going to call it either an omnicompetent God or a maximally perfect God for shorthand. So hence, even the fool is convinced that something exists in the understanding, at least than which nothing greater can be conceived. For when he hears this, he understands it, and whatever is understood exists in the understanding. And assuredly, that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. For suppose it exists in the understanding alone, then it would be conceived to exist in reality, which is greater. But since it's the greatest possible being, it must exist, right? So the idea is that something that only existed in my imagination, just in my own understanding, is less of a being, a non-perfect being, and any being that existed in reality, right, is greater than a being that just exists in my own understanding or imagination. So it says, therefore, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater being can be conceived. But obviously this is impossible. Hence, there is no doubt that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived and exists both in the understanding and in reality. And so again, we can reformulate this argument. Some of the background ideas that might be helpful for you here, I have listed here the idea of a contingent truth. We talked a little bit around this idea before, something that's true but is not necessarily true versus necessary truth, right? So contingent truth, something that is but need not necessarily be and might not be again. And then Anselm has three basic assumptions that are driving this argument: that God's a maximally perfect being, key idea there; that everybody, even the fool, has some conception of divine nature, of what the divine might be like; and that existence is a kind of perfection. So non-existence is a flaw and existence is a perfection. So here's a reconstruction of Anselm's argument. If God does not exist in reality, then God exists only in the understanding. If God exists only in the understanding, then a being more perfect than God is possible. Thus, if God does not exist in reality, then a being more perfect than God is possible. A being more perfect than God is impossible. Thus, God exists in reality. So valid argument forms. The only question is, are the premises true? Is the argument sound? Right. So again, you might pause here and review this argument for a little bit, and then go on to the next little section here, as I'm about to do, and discuss a criticism of at least Anselm's version of the ontological argument. This is Guanillo's Lost Island. And he gives a counter argument, almost a parody argument, to the Anselm's version of the ontological argument. So he says, he gives a thought experiment. And his basic idea here is that if you apply Anselm's reasoning generally, then it's so counterintuitive that we should reject that version of the ontological argument. So he says, now, if someone should tell me that there is such an island, he's asked the reader to imagine the most perfect island that they can imagine, right? So now if someone should tell me that there is such an island, I should easily understand his words, in which there is no difficulty. But suppose he went on to say, as if by logical inference, you can no longer doubt that this island, which is more excellent than all lands, exists somewhere, since you have no doubt that it is in your understanding. Remember, existence is supposed to be a perfection. So if I imagine the perfect island, then that would mean, according to Anselm's reasoning, that that island exists not only in the understanding, but somewhere out in the ocean, actually. And since it is more excellent not to be in the understanding alone, but to exist both in the understanding and reality, for this reason it must exist. For if it does not exist, any land which really exists will be more excellent than it, and so the island already understood by you to be more excellent will not be more excellent. Should I believe that this perfect island exists? Anselm's answer is no. So he interprets, Guanillo's answer is no. And in doing so is leveling a criticism against Anselm's version of the argument. So here's how Guanillo interprets Anselm's argument. If X is a perfect entity, then X must exist. X is a perfect entity, thus X must exist in reality. So fill in X with either the perfect God or the perfect island. So that's what he's trying to draw out there, is that the idea that just because I've imagined this perfect thing in my mind, in my understanding, or in my imagination, is insufficient to show that it exists in reality. And here we haven't even gotten to the idea of, well, if in my perfect island, what if it had one less grain of sand or one less palm tree? Would it still be perfect, right? So you really have to get very clear about what you mean by a maximally perfect being, just as you would have to get very clear by what you really mean by a perfect island, right? And so there's that issues in the backdrop of that as well. There's another famous criticism of Anselm's argument leveled by Kant, who is a theist, but didn't think that existence is a predicate, which is a problem that he saw in Anselm's argument. So just real quickly going to, again, returning to Guanillo's criticism, he's saying that if X exists, if X is a perfect entity, defined as a perfect entity, then it must exist in reality, right? That's the flaw that he's leveling there. And so that would criticize, that would take aim at one or more of the premises in lines 1 through 3. And so I'll leave it to you to think about which precisely one or more of those lines that criticism is aiming at there. And just like there's a contemporary version of the design argument, fine-tuning argument, there's a contemporary version that's been very influential of the ontological argument as well. It comes from Alvin Plantinga, and here's a reformulation of his version. This comes, I'm using a reformulation here that's in could the divine creator be a jerk article? Less than perfect God, right? Could it be Rick, in other words, right? Well, here's Plantinga's version, or a reconstruction of Plantinga's version, called the modal version of the ontological argument, and it has some kind of key differences between Anselm. So first premise, the concept of God refers to a perfect being, possessing all good traits in their most perfect form. The most perfect kind of existence includes existing in all possible worlds. Modal logic is talking about the logic of possible worlds, and it's a way of thinking about necessity versus contingency. God is not supposed to be a contingent being, but an eternal, a necessary being. So he says there is at least one possible world in which in which there's a God, a perfect being possessing existence in the most perfect way, actually exists. Therefore, God exists in all possible worlds. Right? So with regard to this argument, get into all sorts of issues. again, about how to define God as a perfect being and getting clear about what that means. And then it's worth pointing out that Plantinga doesn't really think that this argument proves God's existence. So here's what he says about that point. So kind of a difference than Anselm there. Here's what Plantinga says about his own version of the ontological argument. He says, our verdict on these reformulated versions of St. Anselm's argument must be as follows. They cannot perhaps be said to prove or establish their conclusion. And notice the ontological argument is not a non-deductive argument, it's a deductive argument, right? But since it was rational to accept their central premise, they do show that it's rational to accept their conclusion. And so what he's claiming the argument does show is that it's rational to believe God exists, right? Which is different than showing God and than proving God exists, right? So Plantinga's argument here is a part of his larger project in responding to the evidential challenge against theism, which says that religious belief is irrational. And so he's not really setting out to prove God's existence there. He's trying to prove that it's rational to believe God exists. And in that reading that I mentioned, but didn't assign, I put it as a recommended reading for this, you'll note that there is a potential criticism here involving premise 3. Some contemporary scholars try to argue that the idea of a maximally perfect God is impossible, that there are contradictions internal to how we might understand the properties or a maximally perfect being, right? So if that were the case, then premise 3, so if you were able to show that the idea of a maximally perfect God involves some kind of logical contradiction, you'd be showing that it's not possible for a maximally perfect being to exist in any logically possible world, and that would be a problem then for this modal version of the ontological argument. All right, that wraps up a little bit of an introduction to the philosophy of religion for us here. As always, if you have questions about anything we covered in the readings or in the video lecture, feel free to bring those up either in the discussion forum, and we can talk about them there, or bring them up in the live session that you'll have later today, or on the day that this video is assigned, rather. All right, I hope everybody's doing well. Y'all take care, and hopefully talk to y'all soon.